Mel Brooks is a living legend in Hollywood, a towering figure in the world of comedy, and a master of turning chaos into laughter. At 98 years old, he has built a legacy filled with unforgettable films such as Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, Spaceballs, and The Producers. These iconic movies shaped the comedic landscape and reflected Brooks' unique blend of satire, parody, and genius storytelling. With his career now firmly cemented in history, Mel has begun to look back, reflecting on the ups, the downs, and the people who made his journey both magical and maddening. When asked about the 6 actors he hated working with, Mel didn't hold back. But for Brooks, the word hate wasn't about resentment. It was more about the frustration and affection that can exist side by side when working with truly gifted, complicated personalities. His list wasn't a hit piece. Instead, it was part confession, part comedy roast, and part heartfelt tribute to those brilliant artists who challenged him while helping shape some of his greatest work. The first actor, Mel mentioned, was Dom DeLuise. Dom was beloved not only by audiences, but also by those who worked with him. He had a huge heart, an infectious laugh, and a warmth that lit up every room. That warmth, however, was exactly what caused trouble on set. Dom was simply too funny, to the point that he'd often crack up during scenes, laugh before takes started, and derail the flow of production. Mel compared directing Dom to managing a child in a candy store. Overwhelming enthusiasm, minimal focus. Scenes that should have taken 1 or 2 takes often took up to 10 because Dom couldn't stop laughing. One memorable moment during the filming of History of the World, Part I involved Dom breaking down into laughter for 45 minutes over a single glance from fellow actress, Madeline Kahn. Though this caused delays, Mel couldn't stay angry. Spirit was contagious. His cooking, his generosity, off-camera, and his undeniable comedic presence brought joy to everyone. Mel jokingly claimed he yelled "cut" more times with Dom than any other actor, but each successful take was pure gold. Next on the list was the iconic Madeline Kahn, who brought an entirely different kind of energy to set. If Dom represented joyful chaos, Madeline was all about perfection, a master of timing and character nuance. She had strong opinions, endless questions, and a fierce commitment to her roles. She worked with Mel on multiple films, including Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, High Anxiety, and History of the World, Part 1 each time. She delivered unforgettable performances, but not without behind-the-scenes friction. Madeline often arrived late to set, calmly unconcerned while the crew waited. She would then proceed to transform her scenes, rewriting dialogue and suggesting changes to other actors' performances. Mel admitted that she drove him to the edge, but also elevated the material in ways no one else could. Her portrayal of Lily Von Stupp in Blazing Saddles and Elizabeth in Young Frankenstein showcased her brilliance. Even if it came at the cost of countless retakes and passionate debates, Gene Hackman's inclusion might surprise fans, considering he only worked with Mel once, but that one collaboration in Young Frankenstein left a strong impression. Playing the blind hermit, Hackman brought emotional depth and sincerity to a hilarious scene. Yet, behind the scenes, things were tense. Hackman, a serious dramatic actor, approached comedy with the same intensity he gave to his Oscar-winning performances. Mel described working with him as trying to do jazz inside a pressure cooker. Hackman resisted improvisation and spontaneity, which clashed with Mel's free-flowing directorial style. Despite the tension, the final scene was a masterpiece, but Mel knew one project was enough. Hackman was brilliant, just not built for the madness of Mel's comedic world. Harvey Korman was another name on the list, and this one hurt a bit more. Harvey had a long history with Mel, starring in Blazing Saddles, High Anxiety and History of the World, Part 1, a veteran comedian. Harvey had the skill and charisma to light up any scene. But Mel said he was also highly opinionated, and sometimes difficult. Harvey questioned scripts, offered unsolicited advice, and occasionally acted like he was directing the movie himself. Mel admired his talent, but admitted that ego could get in the way. Their most heated conflict came during History of the World, when Harvey insisted on rewriting several jokes. They compromised by filming both versions, and to Mel's surprise, Harvey's version often worked better. The creative tension between them was challenging, but undeniably fruitful. Then came Cloris Leachman, whose performance as Frau Blucher in Young Frankenstein became iconic, particularly the running gag, where horses neighed every time her name was mentioned. But Leachman's intensity behind the scenes was anything but comedic. Mel said she treated every line like a dramatic monologue, analyzing motivations, resisting on-fly changes, and demanding high standards from everyone around her. While her meticulous nature sometimes slowed production, her fierce dedication resulted in unforgettable scenes. She could steal a moment with a single glance, and Mel admitted that her perfectionism often made the movie better, even if it left him mentally exhausted. Lastly, Mel mentioned Terry Gare, who played Inga, the quirky and charming lab assistant in Young Frankenstein. Though her role was relatively small, she made a big impact. Mel said Terry was smart, sharp, and knew exactly what she wanted. As a newcomer to Mel's set, she quickly asserted herself. She didn't want to be seen as just eye candy. She fought for her character to have substance, wit, and presence. Her chemistry with Gene Wilder was electric, and her comedic timing elevated the film. Mel respected her determination, even when it led to disagreements. Each of these actors challenged Mel Brooks in their own way. They made his job harder, but they also made his films better. His stories about them are filled with humor, admiration, and honesty. The frustration, the laughter, the chaos, it all became part of the magic that defined Mel's career. These weren't enemies. They were creative forces that pushed the boundaries of comedy and brought out the best, and sometimes the craziest. In Mel Brooks himself, Mel Brooks once opened up with candid honesty about what it was like working with some of the most talented, yet most challenging actors of his long career. One such name was Terry, a performer Mel deeply respected but admitted was difficult to direct at times. He likened the experience to walking on eggshells. Terry had a strong sense of how she wanted her character to be portrayed, everything from her lines and wardrobe to how she interacted with others on set. She disliked being rushed and wasn't afraid to speak up when something felt off. Mel recalled one particular moment when he asked her to deliver a joke in a more exaggerated tone. Terry disagreed, feeling it didn't suit her character. They debated for nearly an hour before deciding to film it both ways. In the end, Terry's version made the final cut. Mel praised her instincts but confessed that moments like those were mentally draining. She wasn't loud or combative, but she was steadfast, and, once she made up her mind, there was no changing it. Despite these tense moments, Mel admired her intelligence and commitment to the role. She had a quiet intensity that made the entire cast take their work more seriously. While she wasn't as playful as others on set when she did joke, it landed perfectly. Mel described her as a subtle but undeniable presence. She may not have been as vocally disruptive as Dom, or as boldly outspoken as Malene, but her impact was just as strong. Though they only worked together on one film, her fierce dedication left a lasting impression. She made Mel's list, not out of disruption, but because of her relentless commitment to doing things her way. But perhaps the most emotionally complex name on Mel's list was Gene Wilder. This wasn't just another actor. Gene was a dear friend, a comedic partner, and in many ways, a soulmate. They worked together on some of Mel's most iconic films, The Producers, Blazing Saddles, and Young Frankenstein, which they co-wrote. Gene had a rare gift, a brilliant comedic mind, a deeply kind heart, and a way of delivering humor that was both absurd and emotionally profound. Yet Mel admitted Gene could be incredibly hard to work with, not because of arrogance or ego, but because he was a quiet perfectionist. Gene didn't yell or demand the spotlight. Instead, he internalized everything. And if a scene didn't feel right, he couldn't let it go. Sometimes he would walk off set, not out of anger toward others, but out of frustration with himself. He wanted every performance to be perfect. Mel remembered long nights with Gene, rewriting scenes, debating character motivations, and agonizing over the smallest details. It was emotionally taxing, but also deeply rewarding. Gene's passion matched Mel's intensity. They often argued like brothers, cooled off, and came back to create magic. One of Mel's most emotional memories was making Young Frankenstein. It was a true labor of love and a test of their friendship. Every joke, every shot was debated. In the end, the final product was a masterpiece. Gene pushed Mel more than anyone else ever did, and while that could be exhausting, it was also inspiring. Gene never let Mel take shortcuts. He made him work for every laugh, and the result was always stronger because of it. Gene Wilder made the list, not because he was hard to love, but because he made the creative process personal, emotional, and unforgettable. At 98 years old, Mel Brooks reflects on these actors with a mixture of weariness, admiration, and affection. When he says he hated working with them, it's always said with a smile. In Mel's world, hate doesn't mean dislike it. It means they challenged him, pushed him, made him think harder, and brought out his best. They were his toughest collaborators, but also his greatest creative rewards. These weren't enemies. They were the fire that forged timeless work. Another surprising name on the list was Gene Hackman. He's best known for his intense performances. In serious dramas, Hackman played the blind hermit in Young Frankenstein, a scene that became iconic for its blend of physical comedy and tender emotion. But Mel revealed that making the scene was far from funny. Gene was incredibly serious about his work. He came to set fully prepared, focused, and expected everyone else to match his level of discipline. That intensity clashed with Mel's more improvisational, fast-paced approach. Mel encouraged spontaneity and silly experimentation, while Gene preferred consistency, careful rehearsal, and strict structure. Mel described it as trying to play jazz with someone who reads sheet music note by note. Gene wasn't rude, just intensely focused. While others joked around and laughed between takes, Gene stayed in character. Mel respected that, but their creative styles simply didn't match. After Young Frankenstein, they never worked together again. Not out of personal dislike, but because their methods were too different, Mel said. Filming with Gene was like walking a tightrope full of tension, but leading to unforgettable results. The performance was brilliant, but the process was exhausting. Then came Cloris Leachman, a complete contrast to Hackman. Cloris was loud, curious, bold, and full of energy. Mel called her one of the finest actors he'd ever worked with, but also one of the most challenging. She never took direction at face value. If Mel gave her a note, she would ask why, again and again. She needed to understand every line, movement, and emotion before she could perform it. This analytical nature slowed things down, Mel said. She was like a wild horse, powerful but impossible to steer. In Young Frankenstein, she played the spooky housekeeper, Frau Blucher. Clarice wanted the role to be darker and more serious, while Mel envisioned something funnier and more whimsical. They debated constantly, filming scenes both ways. Sometimes she was right, other times Mel had to beg her to try his version. Same dynamic played out in High Anxiety, where she played Nurse Diesel. Their personalities clashed, not with shouting, but with constant disagreement. Mel admitted she wore him down with her relentless questions. After a day on set with Cloris, he joked he needed a nap. Off camera, they remained friendly but distant. Cloris existed in her own creative world, full of deep ideas. She didn't care about screen time or applause zone, the truth of her character. That focus made her unforgettable, but also exhausting. Richard Pryor was another unforgettable name. One of the greatest comedians of all time, Richard was Mel's first choice to play the lead in Blazing Saddles. Richard was smart, fearless, and used comedy as a weapon against injustice. He helped write the script, shaping its bold, biting tone. But when it came time to cast him, the studio said no. Richard's reputation for being unpredictable, struggling with addiction and missing meetings scared them. Mel fought hard for him, but ultimately lost. Richard stayed on as a writer, but wasn't allowed to act. Mel never hated Richard. He hated the system that shut him out. Richard had helped shape the heart of the film, even if he wasn't its face. That loss stuck with Mel. Through all these experiences, Mel Brooks came to understand a vital truth about creativity. Not all great actors are easy to work with. The most brilliant ones often challenge everything. They question. They resist. They bring intensity, chaos, and fire, but they also help create unforgettable art. Working with Gene Hackman taught Mel about the clash of styles and how seriousness could elevate comedy. With Cloris Leachman, he learned patience and saw how relentless curiosity could sharpen a performance. With Richard Pryor, he saw how fear can stifle genius and how loss can still leave a mark of brilliance, even now. Mel speaks of these actors, not with bitterness, but with respect. He understood the cost of collaboration. Great comedy often comes from great tension. These weren't petty arguments, they were creative battles that led to lasting greatness. The stress, the friction, the exhaustion, he didn't enjoy those parts. But he never stopped being grateful for the art they produced. These 6 actors weren't just difficult, they were extraordinary forces that shaped Mel's legacy. And maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest joke of all, that the hardest people to work with are the ones you end up cherishing the most, because they push you beyond your limits, challenge your ego, and leave behind something that endures. For Mel Brooks, the chaos was always worth it because out of that chaos came comedy, truth, and timeless film. Richard Pryor was a creative force, but working with him was never easy. There were writing sessions planned, sometimes 2 in a day, but he didn't always show up. His moods shifted without warning. One moment he'd be the life of the room, cracking jokes and overflowing with energy. The next, he'd be silent or completely missing. Mel Brooks once compared the experience to waiting for lightning. Couldn't predict when it would strike, but when it did, it lit up everything. Amid the chaos, Richard's writing played a massive role in shaping the bold, unfiltered voice of Blazing Saddles. His raw honesty gave the film its power and unforgettable edge. Mel admired that brilliance deeply, even if it came wrapped in unpredictability. Richard lived in a world of his own, one filled with genius but also marked by deep personal pain. Though Mel genuinely wanted to help him, he also needed someone dependable for such a major role. Replacing Richard was a painful decision, one Mel later called one of his biggest regrets. While Richard didn't appear on screen, his influence ran through every scene. His ideas, his words, his bravery, they remained in the film's DNA. The two stayed friends, and Mel never held it against him. He saw Richard not just as a comedian, but as a true artist, someone who couldn't be boxed in by rules or routines. Yet Mel also recognized the burden of that kind of artistic freedom. The next person on Mel's list was someone even closer, his wife of over 4 decades, Anne Bancroft. Mel often joked that she was the hardest actor he ever directed, but also the one he loved the most. Anne was fierce, intelligent, and brutally honest. She never hesitated to speak her mind. They worked together on To Be or Not to Be, a World War II-era film that blended humor, drama, and politics. Mel directed and acted in it, while Anne took the lead female role. One might assume working with your spouse would be easy, but it wasn't. Anne wasn't one to sugarcoat. If a line didn't work, she said so. If she disagreed with a scene, she made her opinion known, sometimes with just a glare. Mel confessed that she intimidated him, not because she was unkind, but because she was always a step ahead. On set, she treated him as a peer, not her director. Their creative clashes were intense, but never cruel, and insisted on truth in every moment. When Mel asked for more emotion, she would challenge him with, "What kind of emotion?" She pushed him to think harder, dig deeper. Mel once said she was the only actress who could make him rewrite a scene just by giving him a look. That tension translated into something beautiful on screen, and added strength and depth to the film, playing even the silliest lines with honesty. Offset, they left their disagreements behind. At home, they returned to their loving rhythm. Mel would make her tea, and she'd ask about his day. But once back on set, the battle resumed. Despite the difficulty, Mel always said Anne was the most brilliant, most powerful woman he had ever known. She didn't let him settle. She pushed him to be better, and he loved her all the more for it. Then came Dom DeLucia. Man, Mel said drove him crazy, but also made him laugh like no one else. Dom was a comedic genius, full of joy and energy, and known for his booming, contagious laugh. But that laugh often got in the way. Dom had a habit of breaking into fits of giggles right in the middle of scenes, sometimes at his own jokes, sometimes at someone else's. And it wasn't just the actors, his laughter would ripple through the whole set, cracking up the crew and ruining multiple takes. Mel got frustrated, not because Dom lacked talent, but because the endless laughter made filming so much harder. Any scene requiring careful timing or seriousness was a challenge. Still, when Dom managed to stay in character, the results were pure magic. Mel admitted that, despite the constant interruptions, Dom brought so much heart and happiness to every film. His silliness was unmatched. Mel once said working with Dom was like wrestling a feather-covered bear. You'd never win, but you'd have the time of your life. Madeline Kahn was another unforgettable collaborator. She was brilliant, stylish, and hilariously sharp, but also fiercely particular. Madeline never hesitated to question a line or scene if she felt it needed work. She would keep asking for changes until it felt just right, while Mel admired her intelligence and high standards. Her feedback often made the process longer and more complicated. Mel could write what he thought was a flawless joke, and Madeline would simply stop, look at him, and ask, "You sure about that?" That one line was enough to send him back to the drawing board. But she wasn't trying to be difficult. She genuinely cared about the work. Her performances, from Blazing Saddles to Young Frankenstein, were always exceptional. Her timing was flawless, and her delivery made even the wildest scenes feel grounded. Mel once said working with her was like playing chess with a grandmaster. You had to stay sharp, be ready, and respect the process. Her passion sometimes wore him out, but it also made his films better. Then there was Cloris Leachman, the ultimate perfectionist. She was immensely talented and gave every scene her all. But she could be obsessive. Cloris would focus on everything from the lighting to the fabric of her costume to the emotional weight behind every word. She even asked how long a pause between lines should last. Mel joked that Cloris had more notes than he did, even though he was the director. She challenged him constantly, which slowed things down and gave the crew more work. Things she was usually right. Young Frankenstein, Cloris transformed a relatively small part into one of the movie's most memorable characters. Her intense dedication elevated the entire production. Mel may have groaned about her never-ending list of concerns, but he always admitted she was a powerhouse who made everything better. Cloris didn't accept good enough. She chased greatness, and she expected everyone else to do the same. This is the thread connecting all these so-called difficult actors. None of them were incompetent. In fact, they were some of the most talented people Mel ever worked with. What made things hard wasn't their lack of skill, but how much they demanded from him. They made Mel dig deeper, think harder, and often second-guess himself. But that struggle led to greatness. Whether it was Madeline's sharp critiques, Dom's uncontrollable laughter, or Cloris's attention to detail, these collaborators helped Mel create some of the most iconic comedic moments in cinema. Mel didn't truly hate them. What he hated was how exhausting it was to keep up with their brilliance. And that kind of frustration was really a disguised form of deep admiration and love. One surprising name on the list was Gene Hackman. Known for intense, dramatic roles, Gene wasn't someone most people associated with Mel's wild comedies. But when they worked together, Gene brought a different kind of challenge. He was extremely serious, while Mel thrived in creative chaos. In spontaneous humor, Gene took a methodical, almost theatrical approach. He needed to understand his character's backstory and motivations. He asked tough questions like, "Why am I doing this?" Mel had to answer with, "Because it's funny." Gene's deep intensity didn't always blend smoothly with Mel's freewheeling style. Gene approached each scene like it was a war drama, even if the script was filled with absurdity. Created tension, but Mel soon realized that Gene's seriousness actually made the comedy stronger. His grounded performances served as the perfect contrast to the surrounding madness, making the jokes hit harder. Though directing Gene was tough, his professionalism and skill brought something powerful to the screen. In truth, every person on Mel Brooks's so-called hate list was among the most gifted artists he'd ever worked with. He didn't hate them in the real sense. What wore him out was how much they pushed him, how they forced him to stretch beyond his comfort zone. But that's exactly why he respected them. Mel built his career on controlled chaos, never settling for boring or safe. He believed in the creative friction that arises when strong, passionate minds collide. And these actors, they brought that fire to every project. Dom DeLuise made people laugh until they cried. Alan Khan refused to compromise on quality. Cloris Leachman made sure every detail mattered. Gene Hackman brought emotional depth. Richard Pryor lit up the script with his raw honesty. And Anne Bancroft challenged Mel with fierce love and intellect. Mel once said, "These people drove me nuts, but they made my movies great." In his world, hate was just another word for admiration. Meant they left an unforgettable mark. They weren't easy to work with, but they were essential to his legacy. Even at 98, Mel Brooks remembers every difficult moment, because those moments turned into scenes that fans still treasure today. When Mel uses the word hate, he really means respect. He means love in its purest, most demanding form. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest lesson is this: the people who push us the hardest often help us create our very best work. So which of these actors surprised you most? Was it Richard's unpredictable genius or Gene's intense seriousness? Whoever you choose, one thing is clear: Mel Brooks' legacy wouldn't be what it is without them. And perhaps being on Mel's hate list was actually the highest compliment he could give.